Okay, this is the walkthrough for the Tic Tac Toe exercise. And we will get started. The first thing that I do is change the title, because you should always change your title first. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up this wireframe, and I'm going to make my way through that wireframe one element at a time until I go from the top to the bottom, and that will end up with my document object model. So I've got the body first. Now what I want to do is I want to insert an ID of wrapper. So that's what I'm pulling up there. For now, I'm not going to create any CSS. I'm just working on the structure. So I've got my content for the ID wrapper there. Next element. Next thing I want to do inside the wrapper, I want the header. And inside the header, I want a div of ID image left, logo, and image right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the logo as the first element. And I want to make sure that goes inside the header. And you'll notice in this case, none of the elements in my header have actual text to them. They're all three going to be images. So I'll just leave that text there as a holder text to take the place of what I'm trying to do. And so the next thing that I need to do is I need to do image left and image right. And the reason I knew which order to do those in is because I was looking at this DOM where I've got the body, the wrapper, the header, and inside that, in the normal flow, I've got logo left and right. So those will actually end up moving out of normal document flow in order for us to implement this. So that takes care of the header. The next thing I need to do is outside of the header, but within the wrapper. So in this section right here, I need to create a div with the ID of players. And that needs to be outside of the header. And this is going to be the place that holds the information about the players and the score. So I've got in here, I've got an H1 that says Tic Tac Toe, and then an H2 that says players. And those need to go inside of here. Now since I'm inserting actual content within this div, I'm going to get rid of that placeholder text. And that needs to be an H1, so I inserted the content there. Whoops. somewhere in the process there I deleted my opening div tag, so let's undo that. And I want to take and turn this text into an H1. So we've got the H1 of Tic Tac Toe, the H2 of players. Now what I want to do is I'm going to have 3 paragraphs here, and they're going to be duplicated. So we'll have one for player 1, one for player 2. So let's just do one thing at a time. Here we want to have a paragraph with the class of player name and the text of player 1. I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy that. And no, I'm not going to copy that because it's got smart quotes. Player 1, and what I want to do is I want to make that paragraph, I want it to have a class of player name, and that's just coming off of this information right here. Get the class of player name, and that should say player 1. I'm going to do a new paragraph. And now that automatically went to player name, so be careful of that. This is anticipating what I want, and it's not what I want in this case, so just be aware of that. That should be player score, so I'm going to change that to player score. And the text in there is just the word score. Do another paragraph. Again, it put in the class from the previous paragraph. I don't necessarily like that functionality, but it's just because I'm not familiar with it. So that one should be score. So we'll get rid of that part. So I'm just matching up my document object model, and then what I want to do is put the score in here of 0 because no one ever wins at tic-tac-toe. Okay, so now I've got a group of information here, and what I want to do with that is I need the same exact thing for player 2. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do a paste, just change that to player 2. I'll go ahead and refresh that so you can see it. So here's player 2. You notice this stuff is just laying out down the left side. It's going to do that until we actually apply rules to this. All we're doing is laying out the structure from the DOM right now. So we've taken care of that, and that closes out the players portion of what we're doing. So now what I need to do is I need to start another div of board. So I come in here, and what kind of content do I put in there? Now what I'm going to have is I'm going to have 9 divs here, and so I'm going to go ahead and make one, and then I'll use that to carry out the rest of them, because there's some consistencies and some differences here. So what I'm going to do is just div ID of box 1 with a class of left. I'm going to take out that text because I'm putting some placeholders in there. Make sure you haven't deleted your opening and closing div tags. So what I wanted that to be is box 1, and what I wanted that class to be was left. Just want to double check that to make sure I'm getting it right. Yep, so my class is left, div ID is box 1. See, now I could go through and create these rules as I'm going. I prefer to separate them out so that you can see what's going on. You can actually get your DOM up there before you start manipulating it. So we've got, I'm leaving that content, that placeholder content right there for now. I'm going to take that out later on when I add the images that need to be in there. And just for an efficiency, well, I'll go ahead and add it this way. I'm going to insert another div, and that's a class of center and an ID of box 2. Where did I get that? Again, going back to my model here, I'm on box 2 and a class of center. You'll notice that the classes, first off, you'll notice that these are getting both an ID and a class. We haven't done that previously, but you can do that. But there's some consistencies here. Like class left is going to take care of all 3 of these boxes. Class center is going to take care of all 3, and class right is going to take care of all of those. So that the reason we're using those classes is so that we can enter a rule one time, and it can apply to all the boxes that are relative to it. Now I'm going to go ahead and build out the rest of those 9 boxes. And once I build out those boxes, this is basically what the page looks like. Pretty boring. But that's what we're going to do in the next section. Is we're going to add some presentation and some page layout to that. But this is the Tic Tac Toe board that we will create. This is got all the HTML that we need in there, and so that takes care of this part. Okay, so before we get into the presentation, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some images to this content so that we've got all our content in place before we start to actually start manipulating the presentation. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add, there's actually only 3 images on this page. They're just duplicated. We've got the X, we've got the O, and we've got the Tic Tac Toe. So I'm going to add those images to my site, and then I will add them to my content. So now what you need to do is you need to download the images, which will be available for the class and the content section of the D2L for the class. So you need to go ahead and download those images and add them to your exercises folder where your Tic Tac Toe is stored. And you'll notice that in this case I've just gone ahead and downloaded it and unzipped it directly into the exercises folder. And so the folder is called Tic Tac Toe Images, and it's right there and available for me to use. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to add the images. I've got the X and the O up here, and then I've got this pattern of X's and O's, which is a typical tic-tac-toe pattern where nobody gets 3 in a row. And so I'm going to go through and add those images. You should do that now. So this is where the logo goes. The tic-tac-toe logo is this red image up here. The X's and O's go into the appropriate places. Go ahead and do that now. And when you do that, make sure that you get rid of that content, those placeholder text words that are there, because you're going to replace those with the images and will no longer need those placeholder text elements. Remember that when you are adding the image elements, you need to have alternate text. And you're going to end up something like this. It's just a series of X's and O's going up the side, of course, our scoreboard and our header, and we want to make sure that we get rid of this content for ID wrapper goes here. So go ahead and clean up any of that kind of stuff that is in there. I want to make sure that this wrapper div, I see right there that it's not going around all my content, so that should be inside the body tag. And you can always check the context of where you're at by clicking in different locations. So that's just an extra one there. So you can check the location that you're in. So here I'm in a wrapper and body. When I come inside of here, I'm inside of players, and then wrapper, and then body, which tells me that I got a missing div tag there. So that needs to come out of there, and it needs to come up in front of board. Okay, so we're squared away there. Now we need to go ahead and start working on the page layout and the presentation. So the first thing I want to do, I've got my body element here. I want to go ahead and give it some color so that I can see what's going on. So I'm going to create a new rule for the body tag. And I click on the CSS here, or I could go in another way, and I'm going to do a new CSS rule. And I just want it to say body, and so that would be a tag. So I've got div. I want to do it in this document only because we're not using external style sheets. I click on the OK, brings up my dialog box, and I just want to give it a background color, and I want that background color to match the color that I used in my X's and O's. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply that, and you'll notice that everything takes on that color, or the background of everything, because we haven't applied any other colors. So I click OK, and so that's going to allow us to sort of be better able to see what we've got going on. The next thing that I want to do is I've set up this wrapper so that I can use that as a containing div, and so that I can center the page. And so I want to go ahead and create some rules for that. And this time choosing a different means of access, I'm going to choose the new rule here, and it's an ID this time. So I bring that up, and what I want to do, there's a couple things that I want to do. First off, I'm going to be using this as a containing div, meaning that it will allow me to position things relative to the wrapper div. In other words, it's going to serve kind of like the aquarium that I sometimes talk about. That wrapper is going to become the edge of the aquarium, and it will keep everything that's inside of it inside of it. So I'm going to set a position to relative on that, and what that does is it gives you the ability to use that div as a reference for other positioning statements later on. The other thing I want to do is I want to give it a width. Let's just give it 90%, and that will give us the ability to kind of move in from the edges. It'll also give us the ability to center the page. And so what I want to do in order to center it, I want to set my margins left and right to auto. So with those three elements, with a width, a margin left, and a margin right to auto, then it centers in the body page. Red, and then we've got this wrapper here now. In order to understand what I've got working with the wrapper, I want to go in here and I want to give it a background color of white. So you can see how this is centered within the page. So now we've got our containing div set up, we've got our body set up. Now we need to actually start going in and making this page look the way that it does here. And so we've got that outer portion is red, we've got the wrapper, which contains all the other elements, are white, and then what we need to do is start laying out, and we'll use the background color of black a lot. So let's move forward. Now the most efficient way to do this is to look at those things that are going to be consistent across the page, where we can create one rule that is going to apply to everything, or to almost everything. So what can we do in here that is going to make our job more efficient? One of the things that we could do is we've got text that's white in some places, but it's black in other places. So that's not going to really be a good place for us to start. We've got background colors. How about borders and padding, or padding? Because we're going to need some space around all of our different elements. So let's go ahead and create a rule that is going to set padding on those elements that we're using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up in here and I'm going to make a new rule inside the styles section, and it's going to be a rule that applies to multiple elements. So what I've got is the elements that I want to apply this to. I've got header, and then a comma indicates that I'll be doing another element. I'm not using a footer. I'm using divs. All of the boxes are divs. I've got paragraphs. I don't want to add padding to them at this point. I've got H1s. I've got H2s. I've got the ID of board. I've got the ID of players. And I'm just making my way through the code here to see what I've got. I've got image left and image right. Oh, those are IDs. If they were classes, I would use a dot image left, but I'm doing IDs. Oh, I've got the logo. Okay, so that takes care of all of the elements that I want to do. So I want to do my curly brackets, and as you've seen, I like to do both of my curly brackets before I start assigning properties to these elements. And what I want to do is I want to do padding. Let's start with 10 pixels. Or if I wanted to, I could look at doing EMs, which it's a good habit to be in anyway. And so I'm going to do that. And when I'm using EMs, 10 pixels is 0.625 EMs. And the way that I came at that number, and I'm going to go ahead and put a comment in here just so that I know where that number came from. When I go ahead and refresh, it spaces everything out. We still can't really see what that's doing because we haven't laid out our board yet. So let's go ahead and take a look at our board, see where we're at. Okay, so the next thing that I see is that I've got some background properties here that I want to work with. I'm using my board, my players, and my header. I'll use a black background. So headers, players, and board. So I'm going to come in again, same kind of thing. So now there's a lot of things going on here. We've got our background all set in all of those elements. We've got our spaces here, and now you can see the padding between them because it's not just all white. Let's go back once again to our thing, and you can do this stuff sort of in any order that you want. I like to do it in this order just to reduce the amount of things that I have to do. Now you'll notice that I've got text in this players div. There's none in the board. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and set this players div so that the text is white so that I can see it. Now in these three elements I'll have to change it back to black. Let's go ahead and fix those things. And if we come to our wireframe, just to make sure that we know exactly what we're doing, I've got an H1 and an H2 where that text is white within that players. So to be even more efficient, this I want to have stay black, but this I want to have stay white. So it happens to be that in this case, the only time that I'm using the H1 or the H2 is in that player's element. So I can apply the element to just H1 or H2. If I wanted to, I could also make those compound rules. Like if I was using H1s or H2s somewhere else, I could make that a compound rule so that I could do players space H1 and players space H2 and give them a font color of white. But because I'm only using the H1 and H2 in that one location in this document, what I can do is I can just apply it to the H1s and H2s. And I can apply it together, again being efficient in the way that I'm writing my code. And I'm going to go to, I can't remember exactly the coding on this, and so I'm going to go to my tool that helps me to remember, and I'm going to just choose my type, color, and I wanted to set those to white. And you notice that it shows back up. That text was there before, but it didn't have a rule that allowed it to show through the background color of black. So now we've got our text, the color that we wanted. Let's look back at our element here. So that's white, that's white. This is still black because we never changed that. But when we come down in here, it's missing. So there's that content actually in there. So that's the next thing that we probably need to take care of is we've got these classes here, player name, player score, and score, that we need to set a rule so that the font is black and the background color is white. So again, a new rule. And so I've got a class of player name, so it's dot player name, and then I've got dot player score, and then I've got dot score. So the classes of player name, player score, and score. And what I want to do is background color, white, and then I want the font color, which is specified just as you see above here, to color, so that's applying to the font, and I want that font color to be black, which it is by default, but it doesn't hurt me to assign that score anyway. So now when I go ahead and refresh that, we now have our boxes displaying the way that we want them to. Now the other thing that you'll see here is that our text in this same area is jammed up. We haven't applied the padding to that location. So what we're going to do is, to this same rule, I'm going to add, and I want to make sure that the padding is there on the left. So I'm just going to do padding left. And let's go ahead and stick with 0.625 EMs. Let's see what that looks like. And that's an appropriate amount for that. So by just adding that one extra thing to the rule, that gets the padding in there that we want. And that's good for now. So let's go ahead and bring back up and take one last look at this to see if there's anything else that we have not specifically addressed before we get to tweaking it. Okay, so I think we've got all of it, and if we don't, it'll become obvious to us as we go along. Now we need to start doing our positioning and our floating. So as we bring this up, we've got the Tic Tac Toe in the middle. We've got the header, or we've got the image left on the left and the image right on the right. So how do we want to do that? There's a number of different ways that we could do this. The best thing to do is to figure out what is the most efficient way. So let's take a look at it. So when we're looking at this, there's some complications here, and that's just because things are out of the normal document flow. The normal document flow has the tic-tac-toe first, the image left second, and the image right third. So somehow we need to get these lined up side by side, but they're not in the order that they appear in the normal document flow. So if the normal document flow had this listed first, this listed second, and this listed third, we could just float them next to each other. Bada bing, no problem. But this is out of the normal document flow even for the floating. So we got to look at how do we move that tic-tac-toe off of this side so that the X's and O's can come up beside it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new rule for the logo. And so I create that new rule, and I don't want it a compound rule, I just want it logo. So I click OK, and what I want to do is I want to take that over here. So I know that I'm dealing with positioning, but I want to take it out of the normal document flow so that these other elements can come up. So I know that if I want it those other things to be able to take its location from the normal document flow, I need to position that absolutely. Now, how do I put it in the middle? Well, I've got three elements, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that, I'm going to come in from the left. I'm going to go about 35%. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and that moves that document out of the normal document flow. It's absolute, so it doesn't reserve its space. So that X pops up, but the 0 doesn't. So what do I need to do next? Well, let's go look at that next element. We want this floating over here. Now, we know the first thing that we know is that if we want that to float, we're going to have to give it that rule. So I'm going to go to this image right. I'm going to create a new rule. And in that rule, I'm going to give the box a float to the right. When I click apply, it comes over, but it doesn't go up. So why does it not go up? Let's think about our rules for floating. The only way that an element can come up past another element is if that element too is floating. So the thing most immediately above this image right in the DOM is this image left. So what we've got to do is we've got to apply a rule to this too. And the rule that would allow that to float, or the other element to float up next to it, is also the float property. So we're going to come in and we're going to give that X a float left, and that allows the O to pop up next to it. Even though this tic-tac-toe isn't floating, it's taken out of normal document flow. So this came up next to it, but in order for the O to come up here, the X had to be floating as well. So by floating the X and the X is floating to the left, the O is floating to the right. That brings it up, but you notice that this other stuff has come up and gotten in the way too, because these elements are floating. Those elements want to float up right past them. There's space in the middle. Let's go take that space. So how do we make sure that those elements don't go up next to it? That means that we need to put a clear on. So let's look at our document object model here. So we've been playing with the header. That's that those elements, image left, image right, and logo, are inside the header. And then we've got this next div of players. So how do we keep that from popping up next to it? Again, we create a new rule. And we clear, and I'm going to clear both because we don't want it to float up next to X or the O. We want it to absolutely stop. We click apply. It moves back down. Bada bing, there we have it. The next thing that you're going to notice though is when we did that, the header collapsed because all of these elements are taken out of the normal document flow. So we need to reclaim that space there. So what are we going to do? There's a couple things that we can do. So the one that I'm going to use, because this isn't a very complicated layout, is I'm going to go ahead and give a rule to the header, and what I want to deal with is this overflow property, because as you recall, overflow allows you to reclaim that collapsed space from that header, because it'll say go out to the space that this should be taken up if those elements were in normal document flow. So I choose hidden, which is counterintuitive, but when I choose hidden, then it comes back up and it reclaimed that space. And honestly, for me, understanding how to reclaim collapsed elements when all their elements are moved out of containing the elements contained in them drop from the normal document flow, that's been one of the things that I've struggled with over the years to understand. And it's an important thing to get a grasp on. There's more sophisticated ways of doing that, but we're not going to deal with those at this point. But that's a thing to pay attention to if for some reason you're losing things. It's an element collapsing. So now we bring the prototype back in here, and you'll notice that we're starting to look about like what we expected to. Now I notice that the X is a little crowded and the O is a little more crowded than in our prototypes. We can make the decision whether to move those in or not. We're pretty close as it is. If we wanted, we could add more padding to the left or right of those. I'm not going to do that because we're pretty close to the thing here, and I think it looks good the way it is. And you also have to realize that a prototype is not the final version. It's a place to start in your design efforts. So the next thing that I want to take a look at is this making my way down the page. This H1 for Tic Tac Toe should be centered in the page. So let's go back to our H1. We've got the H1 and the H2. We can't have, I want to center that in the page. We can't apply that to this same rule that we already had. So we're going to have to create a new rule here. And I'm going to come on down to the bottom. And I'm going to apply a rule just for the H1. And so how will I center that? That means I've got to have a width and then my margins set to left and right to auto. So let's set the width to 20%. Let's see what we get away with there. See if it does what we're hoping it will do. So it hasn't really changed the width. Now let's put our margins to auto. See what we end up with. There we go. Simple as that. So now we've got that centered in the page. We've got our players. The next thing it looks like we need to deal with is that these paragraphs, instead of going down the side, should be stacked along the side here. So how are we going to do that? We could float them, or we could mess with the display. I think I'm going to float them because I want to make sure that no matter what size the screen is, that these elements are stacking up next to each other. And so the first thing that I want to do is come in and again look. So I've got player name, player score, and score. And I've already got rules for those that give us the background color, the color, and the padding. What if I went ahead and said that I wanted the width for all of those elements to be, let's do 20%. and that narrows it up. So that gets us out of those long lines. So now we should be able to line those up next to each other. And so how do we do that? We're going to do a float. And I'm going to float them all left. And that sort of does it, but it doesn't do it exactly what we want, because look, player 2 pops up here next to player 1. So those player 1 and player 2, I want player 2 down here. So somehow, since I'm using a float, I'm going to have to clear that float on this player name. So what we're going to do, we're going to come back up in here. We're going to add a new rule. So in order to clear that, what I want to do is I want to address this player name class. So I come up in here and I create a new rule, dot for class, player name. And that pops it down. So next thing that I want to do is I want to space those out. So let's go ahead and see what is our, we got padding in there, but what we want to do is we want to put space between here so that they can't touch each other. So again, player name, player score, and score, if you look at these at the prototype, they're spaced out a little bit from each other. So what I want to do is I want to go in there and I want to manipulate the margins. And I'm just going to manipulate the left margin. And let's go with the consistent 0.625 EMs. Look and see what that does. Spaces it out, but it doesn't get me as wide as I want this to be. So now what I need to do, and this is where the fine-tuning comes in. We've got the width here set at 20%. So 20% is only going to take up 60% plus the little extra bits and pieces. Let's go to 30% and see what that does for us. Okay, so that broadens it out a little bit more. That gets it in the direction of this. So we could get technical here and start making individual rules to make each of these narrower. But I think that for the purpose of our learning, we've gone as far down that path as we really need to. Although I would like to have the margins a little bit larger between them. So let's cut this to, let's change this to 1.0 EM. Gives us a little bit more break, and you can get into tweaking that. So if I did 1.5, then it's too much. So sometimes it does get down to a tweaking level, and you also have to realize that this is going to behave differently depending upon the size of the space that it has to work with, because this is fluid. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we leave ourselves enough space here. So I'm going to go back to 25%. That's going to drop it down. If I really wanted to, I could put a div in there to center it. That's going to make it a little more fluid. But this is good for where we need to be for right now. So now going back to our illustration, we've taken care of most of this. I notice that there's a border up here on the Tic Tac Toe. That Tic Tac Toe, as you recall, is an H1. So if I want to put a border on that, and remember, you have to do all three of the rules here. So I'm going to do medium, double and white. There we go. So now if we take a look at what we've done and we bring up a browser, as long as our viewport is relatively narrow, this is working right. But when you get to a broader viewport, this X floats up because these elements are floating. So we've got to do something to take care of that issue. The way that we're going to fix that is we're going to put a clear on this X. Now let's start thinking strategically here, because we want to make sure we got 9 boxes here with 3 different classes in them. So the classes that we have are class left, class center, and class right. So what we want to do is we want to apply rules to that left, center, and right so that this will lay out. Now the first thing that we want to do, let's go ahead and get the floats working for this, and we'll come back and take care of that clear when a little bit later on. So what I want to do is I want to create a new rule, and I want to create that rule to float left. Let me make sure that that's the right term. So we've got a class of left, just left, not float left. So what we want to do is dot left, and what we want to do is we want to float that to the left. And that allows all those ones that are over here to float over to the left. So we've got some weird things going on here. But let's go ahead and do this systematically. We've also got our center, our class of center. So we'll go ahead and float that too. Let's get all of these floated, and then we'll look at what's going on. And then of course we need the right. And you notice that I'm floating them all left. That's because it's not that important which direction it's floating for this particular moment. So I click on that, and you notice that things will keep floating up and up and up and up over and over and over and over. And so what we've got to do is we've got to think about how do we keep things from floating up next to them. And so when we come into these properties, our left one is over here, center is there, right, they're all floating, but what's happening is this one with the class of left keeps floating up next to it. The same thing here, this one with the class of left is floating up past our player's board. So what we want to do is we want to put a clear on the class left, and what that will do is it will drop all 3 of these rows down to their proper location. So that takes care of most of that, though you see there's some other strange things going on here. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take control of this section up here, because the color is starting to go into our players. And as you recall, that section is called players. So we're going to need to put a overflow on here. I'm going to go ahead, and since we've already got the overflow for the header there, I'm going to add it's an ID of players, and that will add the overflow to it, and it will reclaim that space so that that stuff can't come in there. And the reason that it was going up in there is because everything inside of this players div, or up the bottom stuff, was out of the normal document flow because it's floating, and so that was coming up and grabbing that. We're facing the same problem with our board because all of these elements are floating. This area is collapsing because as you recall, that section down there should be black too, but we can't see them because it's collapsing. So we're going to also add that to this rule. So we've got header, players, and board. And that reclaims that space for that. Now the only thing that we really have left to do is we need to add the white borders in here, or the margins, because if you look at our prototype, we got a line between our players and our header section, and a line between our players and our board section. So that, like everything, there's a couple ways that we can do that. What I'm going to do is, we've got this players rule already. I'm just going to add a top and bottom margin to that. And I'm going to use those consistent numbers that I've been using throughout, just because they're about the right size for what I want. And you notice now we're back, we got our borders back in place. So we've got those borders in there. The only thing we don't have in place now is we need to make sure that these things are sort of centered. What I want to do is I want to find the most efficient way of spacing these out so that they're evenly spaced within this element. Now I could go and apply rules to the IDs. There's 9 different IDs. Or I could come in here and I could apply rules to the left, center, and right. Or I could create a new compound rule here that applies to both the left, the center, and the right. There's different ways to do it. There's not much difference in this case about how to do it. So let's go ahead and give this a width of, let's say, 30%. Notice how that spaces that out. So now it's not really sitting in the center of my space. I've got my image, my spaces, and what I just did is I turned on this ability to see. I turned off the live so that you can see what these spaces are. And what that shows me is that my image is not sitting in the center of those elements. So if I want to move those elements over, the images over within those elements, so this is the left, center, and right, what I need to do is I need to apply rules to those images. And so I only want to apply it to the image inside of the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that when I am in the board and I have an image, to apply these rules. And that's a little bit nicer. So there's a lot of different ways to do this once you get into the point where you are actually tweaking this. So that concludes the tic-tac-toe exercise. Make sure you save it, upload it, and preview it in your browser, and make a link to it from your exercises page so that I can see your work. And if you've got this down, then you're doing pretty good.